Okay, welcome to the 37th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Rod Boothroyd again. And today we're going to be exploring the Sovereign and the King archetype. So Rod Boothroyd is a counsellor, psychotherapist, and a certified healing the shadow practitioner, and the author of the book, The Warrior, Magician, Lover, King, a guide to the male archetypes updated for the 21st century. He works with men, women, and mixed groups to heal the wounds of childhood with Marianne Hill. And he also trains people in the art of working with the shadow and healing emotional wounds. Welcome, Rod.
Good to see you, Piers. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, pleasure. Yeah, so we began the cycle of going back through the archetypes. So we did an introduction. It was about 2 years ago.
That's right.
And then since then, we've gone into the warrior, the magician, the lover. And now today, I'd love for us to explore a bit about the king.
Great idea. Let's go ahead and do just that.
So, what is the king or the sovereign archetype, please, Rod?
I see it primarily as the part of everybody that's the leader in their life. And that's not just about leadership in the sense that everybody tends to think of leadership, as in managing people and having authority over them. It's much more than that. Leadership of oneself, leadership of what goes on up here, control, leadership of self, of the world that you're responsible for, children, family, friends, employees, social groups, all the rest of it. Bringing an energy to all of those places, which is about benevolence, leadership, compassion, wisdom, good judgment. It's the part of you that, in its ideal form, would encompass those qualities and, of course, more, but those are the ones that pop into my mind straight away. Yeah.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you. So, my second question, as we've gone through this series, kind of similar structure is, what makes a balanced and mature king or sovereign?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first point I'd like to make is that if I look around the world today, I don't see that many particularly sovereign people, men or women, to be honest. And although, we're thinking in terms of the male archetypes of warrior, magician, lover, and king, these archetypes aren't just about male qualities, they're about female qualities as well. So for women, we have a queen, the same equivalent archetypal energy in a woman. Leader, queen, heart-centered leader is another term that Marianne uses for this particular part of personality. So what's the balanced and mature form, the one that, in my view at least, is sadly lacking in the world? Well, I think the key thing is it's the absence of triggering of childhood emotional patterns. I hear more and more people saying, I was triggered when so-and-so said or did something. And I think, you were triggered. Well, what you mean by that is that you reacted. And most likely what you mean by that is that you reacted in a way over which you felt you had no control. So in a way, if we were to talk about the definition of kingship and queenship in terms of qualities, I think the first one would be that somebody had done enough emotional healing work not to be triggered into their childhood reactive patterns, or at least to be less triggered, so that when you or I or anyone is less triggered into childhood emotional patterns, we by definition are more mature, more present as an adult in the world. And, in my experience, excuse me, there's a direct correlation between how much emotional healing work somebody has done and how resistant to triggering they are. There's no doubt that the more emotional process work or shadow work or whatever it is that you follow as a practice, the more you do, the more able you are to stay in that mature, grounded, rational, calm place, regardless of what the world throws at you. So that's number one, I think, the absence of something, the absence of reactivity. But it's not as simple as that, as you might expect, because although that's fundamental to it, another quality of kingship, I believe, comes from how you're brought up in the world as a child. That is to say, the positive qualities of wisdom, maturity, good judgment, calmness under pressure, they are qualities, I think, that come in large part from modeling by a parent. Now, I don't know about you, Piers, but you might like to offer an opinion on this. How many men do you meet in your work, or women for that matter, who've been parented by somebody that you could call a true, excuse me, a true sovereign, a true king or a queen?
Very few, to be honest. In my own life and obviously my work with ex-boarders, it's like, yeah, I feel if you put your child in a boarding school age 4, 6, 8, is that a sovereign thing to do? And I question whether it is, to abdicate the responsibility. So the answer is no, I don't meet many sovereigns or people who've had sovereign parents.
Exactly. And the mysterious thing about this particular aspect of becoming a mature king or queen, or even if you don't like the terminology, call it a mature adult, excuse me. The mysterious thing about this is that when you're surrounded by people like that as a child, there's something that seems to infuse itself into the very fabric of your being. It might be hard to define what that is when you're an adult, but it's something that is modeled and you soak up just by being consistently with a parent who embodies that quality of sovereignty. And I'm reminded as I say that of Moore and Gillette, or was it Robert Bly? I don't remember off the top of my head, who pointed out that in pre-literate tribal societies, boys would grow up surrounded by the men of the tribe. They would be there all the time. They would be infused with what it meant to be a man in that tribe, just because of the presence of the older men with them as a group. Same for women, same for girls. And what are the society we're living in, when you think about absent parents, fathers who never see children after divorce, fathers who never see children, who don't see children regularly after divorce, absent fathers, all the rest of it, we're not in a societal structure where a lot of people, boys and girls, get good parenting that can infuse them with the qualities of sovereignty, I judge. So we're talking here, first one was the absence of triggering of childhood patterns, which is about how much emotional work somebody does. The second one is somehow that modeling of sovereignty and kingship by parents. And I think there are two more that are, or at least one more that's really important. How does somebody maintain the quality of being a king or a queen as an adult? I think the answer to that is that in adulthood, they surround themselves with kings or queens, or at the very least, they have a mentor who can keep them on track. So that being a king or a queen in your life as an adult is not a solitary business. If it is, it's wrong. Something's gone wrong. It's a position that one occupies with support from other people. And that leads me to question again, how many people in the society we're living in today really have powerful and effective emotional, social support structures? Again, I guess not that many, really.
No, I think, I found the Mankind Project, where I met you, Rod, to be very supportive.
Yeah.
And yet even that, after lockdowns, I haven't spent as much time going off to the I groups, the weekly groups. So yeah, there's not much.
And I think, if I extend all of that into a picture of society as a whole, the absence of sovereignty becomes quite obvious. It's like we're just not being, well, two things. First of all, we're certainly not being led, in my opinion, by true sovereigns. And secondly, we're not shown, taught, or learn how to exemplify sovereignty in mature adulthood in our own lives, which could account for some of the mess the world seems to be in at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm hearing three things, what makes a balanced and mature king: absence of triggering, reacting, we kind of modeling, we get modeled that sovereignty from others, whether that be parents or others in our community. I think there was that African phrase that it takes a village to bring up a child. So that modeling, I think I heard one story of a child in Ghana when I was living there, or since then, and saying that this child had messed up, and before he got home, the parents had already heard
about it. Yeah.
It's like,
exactly.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
So it's that sovereignty. Yeah, that's the boundary. And then the third thing is surrounding yourselves with kings and queens.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really the long and short of it, to be honest.
Thank you, Rod. So, obviously we've spoken about this extensively in the other podcasts about the shadows. So obviously we have the light side. What about the shadow side here?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, think of the shadow side as, in a few simple words: confidence, a willingness to stand up and be counted. I mean, it's a cliche, but it has the meaning, doesn't it? That you're willing to put yourself out there in some kind of stage and be seen and be heard and stand up for what you believe in. That you perhaps have a purpose and a mission that is the foundation of your life in some sense. That you shine brightly. You could be a leader to others in a crisis. Though all of those are the, as you say, the shining bright, illuminated, positive side. So by contrast, the shadow side is, well, as you know, we have two. We have the inflation and the deflation, which is, let's think of a child, for instance, who comes home and says, look at my scorecard, look at my report card, and look at, and the parent goes, oh, if you'd tried harder, you could have done better. And in that child, there's just that sinking, that sense of not being recognized in their pride and achievement and self-confidence. It's a very common thing. It's not necessarily because parents are ill-intentioned. Parents don't have much time, or they just don't understand because they in turn were not raised by sovereigns. But in the child, something goes ping, a little bit of a wound, a little bit of a chipping away of that child's confidence and self-assurance, and repeated over and over and over again, particularly if they're older siblings, scorning and shaming and belittling, which is what older siblings tend to do because they have jealousy problems, quite understandably. They were the beautiful child in the nest until this unwanted sibling came along. I mean, why should they be nice to a sibling? Now, I know that's a bit extreme, but I think there's truth in it. And the point being, of course, the shaming need not stop there. The humiliation at school, and all the class are competing for teachers' attention, or for, whatever sense of feeling good they can get. Putting somebody else down may be a good way to feel better about yourself, at least temporarily. And so children are victimized at home, school, socially, in the family, and in the broader society. In fact, just to extend that thought for a moment, I'm not so sure that any Western society honors children particularly well. And you can see that in the traditional cultural things that come down to us. Children should be seen and not heard. How anti-sovereign is that?
Yeah.
Children should be seen and not heard. Spare the rod and spoil the child. It was legal in this country to beat children at school in loco parentis, in the place of the parent, until the early 80s. And I think it was even later in boarding schools.
97 or 99, I think it went on in boarding schools.
Wow. I mean, these are not things calculated to generate sovereignty. They're calculated to put sovereignty into shadow. And when it goes into shadow and deflates, what you get is a child who is not confident. Mm. Don't look at me. I don't want to be seen. I don't want to be heard. I have nothing of any value to say. Please look at somebody else. I'm going to get my head right down here and hide. In some sense, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, practically. So that's the deflation. It's a lack of confidence, a lack of self-assurance, a desire not to be seen, not to be heard, and it perhaps even the impossibility of standing up and being seen. I've long thought about this question of people's biggest fear seems to be, or at least the most common fear, seems to be public speaking.
Yeah.
And I've wondered so many times why that is. And I'm still not quite sure of the answer, but what I do think I know is that's a deflated sovereign quality. Because if you were confident and in your power and had something that you believed was valuable to express, would it not be natural to go out there and speak as a king or queen on the stage? And to love doing it, maybe, but at least to be able to overcome the anxiety.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard that often. I think even public speaking's higher on the list even than death.
Yeah.
And it does make me reflect. It's like at schools, you know, how many times we present in front of the class and we receive that shame. So whether it comes from that, and, you know, like you say, the parents, we come home, we have something to share, and it's not received.
Absolutely. Yeah. By contrast, the inflation, see it in quite a lot of people who've been to private schools, particularly boarding schools, is my experience. I believe this to be true, but it may not be, of course. The inflation is pomposity, grandiosity, superiority, you know, the kind of, oh dear, yes, the kind of thing that, yes, I will mention his name, why not? Boris Johnson went to Eton, as did David Cameron, whose fees are £45,000 a year for boarders per person. So there's grandiosity and a privilege in that. Look, they're paying 45 grand a year to keep me at this school, which is regarded as one of the best in the country, rightly or wrongly. How is that going to inflate your sense of self? How is that going to make you feel, falsely perhaps, that you have sovereign qualities that in reality you do not have? Or perhaps the fact that your parents didn't want you at home and sent you away to board, whatever reason they gave for that, gives you such a feeling of inferiority that somehow those two things combine and you become a pompous, inflated, grandiose person who thinks the sun shines out of their backside, for example. Now, I don't really want to go into personalities, but I must say that I have met a lot of people who've been to boarding school who, in my judgment, take the inflated route as a defense against something. I would imagine the wound of being sent away at the age of, what have you said, 4, 6, 8, 10, whatever it is. But anyway, regardless of the boarding school issue, anybody who has a wounded sovereign can inflate, and the inflation is grandiosity, pomposity, superiority. I know it all. Why would I ever want to go to a shadow work workshop? Look at me, I'm shining. I'll just be, I tell you what, if I do go to a shadow work workshop, I'll tell you all what needs to happen here. I'll tell you all what, I don't want to do a piece of work. I'm completely healed, thank you very much. But I can see that you need some support. And thank so you. On. I wasn't speaking personally for this. You know. No, I wasn't speaking personally. But in fact, the truth is somebody in an inflated sovereign would never turn up at a shadow work workshop, because why would they? You know, that kind of sentiment. So there we are, the inflations and the deflations, all defenses against a lack. And the lack, just to reiterate the point if necessary, a lack of true substance, self-confidence, self-assurance, self-belief, confidence, willingness to be humble. It's a very sovereign quality. Willingness to learn from others by example or by seeking out leadership of others. Those are the qualities really of what we were talking earlier on about the servant leadership. It's a great expression and people misunderstand it, but what it basically means is leadership that is for the benefit of everybody. Therefore, the servant leader is a king or queen whose intention is for the greater good of, well, Benthamite, the greatest good of the greatest number, let's put it like that, as opposed to leadership, which is motivated primarily by self-interest, or frankly, even worse, motivated just by the desire for power and power alone, which I think I see in quite a lot of politicians and business leaders around the world, particularly those who've run massive companies, the largest companies in the world. I find it hard to see that those leaders are servant leaders. I think what those leaders are vastly inflated sovereigns driven primarily by a desire for power, which is kind of the opposite of true sovereignty. It's just a gross inflation of a wounded sovereign. Any questions you'd like to ask about that? Because I said rather a lot there. I'm hoping it was all clear.
Yeah, that's very clear. What comes to me as you speak is the word steward when you say servant leadership.
Yes, nice.
It's like I always thought I've watched Lord of the Rings and you see Lord Denethor is a steward of Gondor. And I always look at that and I think, oh, he's lesser. It's more the character that he plays. But I quite like from what Robert Moore talks about in some of his talks, this idea of the steward, it's not mine.
Yeah.
You know, and I love what you say about humility is when, and I see this, you know, when we go into shadow, we lose that humility.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very good point, because in a way it's the spiritual side of the king. You know, this too shall pass. I'm only here as a steward for my lifetime, but my lifetime is devoted to the benefit, the goodness of the people, the benefit of the kingdom. It's not devoted to my grandiosity or my inflation or my this or my that. It's, yeah, I will put myself at least first equal to the people. I won't put myself above them. And I will serve them as best I can, but at the same time, I will make harsh decisions that need to be taken for the good of the kingdom, even though those decisions might disadvantage a few people. But there's a spiritual aspect to all of this. And I see in this, as we talk, the merging of the spiritual aspect and the merging of the practical action taker aspect of the king coming together into a very wholesome leader that people will respect, because they can see that leader is driven by principle and humility and has sufficient strength and power to underpin it.
Thank you. And I can't remember if it was in your book, you speaking about that the king comes on last. And I'd love you to speak a little bit about the importance of us developing the lover, the warrior, and the magician.
Yeah.
First, almost, because that leads us into kingship.
Yes, absolutely. You're quite right. So this is a personal view, right? I think it's got truth in it. I wouldn't say it's the only truth, but I have met quite a lot of men in their 20s and 30s and 40s, even, up to about 50, who say, you know, I want to be a king. What do I have to do to be a king? And to me, what I see when I look at them is that they're still in the warrior phase of their lives, which roughly translates as they're going out into the world and making some kind of mark on the world. It leads me to think that maybe that's what men between 20 and 50 actually have to do. The primary task developmentally is to be a warrior. In other words, as we talked about this some time ago, Piers, you might remember, this was not about making war. It's about making a mark on the world so that the world knows you're present in it.
Mm.
And for women, I think it's actually the same. I think it's similar but different. For women between 20 and maybe 40, the primary function isn't queenship. It is about family and children and relationship. That does not mean to say that there isn't kingship and queenship wrapped up in all of those, because obviously we've already spoken about parents being kings and queens to their children.
Mm.
But it's a different kind of kingship and queenship at that stage of life, I think. And one of the reasons I think the king and queen are naturally programmed to come online around about 40 for women, perhaps, or 50 for men, maybe 40, is that how can you be a rounded king capable of taking complete responsibility for your world until you have enough experience of what it's like to be out in the world doing things, to be in relationship in a wholesome way with other people, and to be sufficiently magician to be successful in solving your problems. It's like those three other aspects of the personality are all an essential part of kingship. And unless they're fully developed, I don't think you're going to get a really well-rounded queen or king. So I think there's a natural progression of, let's call it, life experience. And I do have a belief that, if you look back at, may not be a great example, to be honest, but if you look back at European royalty, those princes and princesses who were thrown into authority early because generally their fathers and mothers have been slaughtered by rivals, so it seems, if you look back at history, they were not very successful as kings or queens because they didn't have the life experience. Now, whether that's literally true or not, I'm not sure, but I think it's a good kind of analogy to explain kingship, and mature queenship come from having life experience. And there's another aspect to it, which is life purpose. So people read books avidly about soul purpose and life purpose and mission and so on. And I think in a way they've got it wrong because, again, I'm not sure, between 20 and 40 or 50, that's your primary task, to have your sole purpose, what you're here on this planet for, defined and to be doing it. I think you find your sole purpose later on when you step more fully into sovereignty, and you find it because of what you've done before, which is probably many different things and many different experiences, all of which inform what emerges as what you'd like to call your soul purpose or life purpose or mission. There's an interesting flaw in that. If you think of our society, children are required at the age of 14 or 15 to start choosing the academic pathway they're on, which can often commit them to a certain outcome. I mean, if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a profession like that, you start making decisions at 14. And maybe that's good for some people because they do know at that age that that's their destiny. But I'd rather question it, to be honest. But, it's just it's just another way of looking at the developmental sequence of archetypes.
I personally feel it is too early. Especially, I see that more and more nowadays with the young men. They're struggling as teenagers. The young women are doing really well, but it's like young men, it's almost like they've lost that purpose. And, as you said earlier, it's almost like having those elders there, the sovereigns, to go, you're okay, model.
Yeah, absolutely. And also to say, look, you don't have to choose what you want to do right now. If you want to do something when you discover and you discover that when you're 30, that's fine. Go ahead and do it when you're 30, not when you're 20 or whatever. But of course, we don't have a society that's set up in that way, really. I mean, it is possible to change career, but I think in perhaps quite limited ways.
Yeah. before I ask the next question, just the last thing there is just the piece kind of is dropping in. The king almost, he finds his purpose. This is just me thinking, so off the top of my head, through what you're saying, this absence of being triggered, it's almost like he's done his inner work. He's worked on what, and he's healing his wounds. And I think Robert Bly talks about this in his book, that the wound is where we give our gift to society. So it's almost like by 40, we've done that work.
Exactly.
Like earlier. Therefore we go, aha, this is what I can give.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it, Piers. I agree with you. I think there's huge truth in that. And I think, on the Mankind Project weekend, there's a section devoted to finding, let's call it mission, which is how MKP phrases it. And it's a great piece. But I've had a lot of men talk to me about that piece and say, I didn't get it. I don't understand it. And I think one of the things that I say to them is helpful in that regard, which is, okay, well, you're 25 or 30 or whatever age you are. Why don't you make your life mission for now as simple as finding out what your life mission really is? Oh, and how do I do that? You just try many different things. And every time you find something that you like, you adjust course. And if that doesn't work, you change course again, so that almost by a series of trial and error experiments in what you find enjoyable, what suits you, what comes naturally, you end up in a place where you have a clearer sense of what your mission might actually be at the point where it becomes important. And that point, I think, is usually for men, late 40s, early 50s, actually. I think that's the point at which a man needs to know what his mission / purpose in life is. For women, perhaps a little bit earlier, maybe. You see, and just to reiterate the point, I think for men, that's when they've stopped being a warrior, as in making a mark on the world. Around about 40, testosterone drops, men's energy drops, except for a few notable individuals, like Rupert Murdoch, for instance, if anybody knows about him, marrying women 60 years younger than him. That might be an exaggeration. Running a massive corporation in his 80s, that kind of thing. That's the exception, it's not the rule. You can't keep up beyond 40 or 50 at the most. I think the majority of men can't keep up with the young bucks who are going out there full of testosterone, making a mark on the world. It has to give way to something more meaningful. For women, when they've raised the children, they've done the family thing, then for them, there's a stepping, I believe, into power, greater power, so that around about the same time in both genders, there's a change of orientation from a previous stage of life task to the next stage of life task. Enough said, I think. I'm just beginning to feel I'm repeating myself.
No, I think that's great. And I think that's the way I find I learn best, is through repetition. So I love that. And it reminds me of what Robert Moore talks about, this idea of the men are very much in our warriors in our 20s, and women more in their lover energy.
Yeah.
And then by the time we get to our 40s, we move more into lover. Yeah. And women move more into warrior.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I see, that women step into their power and men step into a softer place as testosterone drops. Absolutely. I agree with that. And one of the reasons, by the way, Piers, I think that's very necessary for the development of kingship, is that if a man continued to be driven by testosterone into later life, there would be a certain harshness to his sovereignty. When the testosterone drops and the personality softens, for want of a better word, what that allows is the energy of the lover to flow into the sovereign, so that there's a lightness, a kind of elevation, a kind of happiness, a kind of possibility of joy, let's say. If we think just briefly, it's not completely right, but let's think briefly of the lover as equivalent to the inner child, because it's more inner child than anything. that inner child, if it's happy and it's had a joyful upbringing, will infuse the energy of the sovereign with joy and lightness and well-being and cheerfulness and a very positive approach to life, which stops the sovereign being that harsh, tyrannical figure. Equally, the other side of that dynamic is that the energy of the sovereign comes down and ought to boundary the energy of the inner child, which is the loss of triggering that we talked about right at the start of this podcast. So there's a beautiful synergy there in men of increasing lover, increasing sovereign, driven by that feedback between the two. And, you know, if you think of those leaders, political leaders in particular, in the world at the moment, who seem harsh, puritanical, even fascistic, I don't see much fun, joy, or inner child in them. I see a tyrant in them, actually. Another form of the inflation that goes beyond mere grandiosity, goes to power for power's sake. I'm in control, my way or the highway. If you don't agree with me, I'll kick you out. And regrettably, those people seem to be prevalent in the world today, in my opinion, particularly in the field of politics.
And I think I was reading my notes the other day saying that with control, something to do with control, the man who has a need to be most controlling, like a tyrant, is the man whose lover is most out of balance.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Or even non-existent, completely suppressed.
Thank you.
I remember you asked me why Moore Gillette said that the archetype that was most out of balance was the lover. And in my book, I make the claim that I believe it's the king or queen that's most lacking. They use the word lacking, in modern society. Well, why is that? I mean, I think they were right at the time. Men were very driven and very sort of, work ethic. But I think they wrote that in late 80s, early 90s, perhaps. There were then many changes structurally in society. I mean, if you think in Britain particularly, the mines closed, the steelworks closed, heavy industry on a big scale was exported to China. That traditional male roles and values just evaporated, that men were left without any sense of identity. And in that vacuum, women stepped forward and started making demands because nobody else was leading. And I think one of the consequences of that was the so-called new man. I don't know if you were around at the time.
I'm born in the 70s, so I kind of got a...
You got the new man, yeah. What did it mean? It meant you had to be soft and gentle and caring and loving and considerate and put yourself out for your relationship and children, all the rest of it, which of course is perfectly reasonable. But actually, there was a backlash against it, I think, which women found that when they got soft men, they didn't really want soft men after all. What they wanted were men with softness in them and firmness, clarity, direction, masculine warrior quality. Yeah. So I rather suspect that movement had a lot to do with increasing the level of lover in men. And I suspect that loss of identity, the export of traditional male roles to third world economies, and disempowerment and demonization, frankly, in some ways, of men, has contributed in part to the loss of sovereignty as time's gone by. And I think, you can look at politics and you can look at society and changes like that, and you can see clues as to why kingship has diminished and become less prevalent amongst men. But actually, in the end, I think it's a cultural problem rather than a cultural and societal problem rather than an individual problem. That, if you trace this back, Men went off to war, men went into the factories, they were separated from their family, and that's the culture and the society that we've inherited, where children, boys in particular, are not brought up by men who are providing role models to them. And as time has gone by, that has become more and more a feature of our society and culture, so particularly with divorce rates being what they are, and the astounding proportion of men who never see their children after they get divorced. So anyway, we could talk for ages about it, but
yeah,
there's a simple summation of it, Piers. There are not enough kings in society, and there are probably not enough queens in society.
yeah. Well, maybe that would be something to come back to at the end, maybe would be how we change that, how we bring that in. I mean, what I'd love to kind of speak a little bit about the emotional wounds of the king.
Yeah.
What they you've spoken a little bit about them, but I know in your book you say there's specific beliefs and wounds that we have that we carry.
Well, there's two primarily, which take many forms. The first one is, I'm not good enough. I mean, that is the wound that children pick up. It's implanted in them left, right, and centre, at home, at school, by thinking parents, unthinking parents, caring teachers, uncaring teachers. The truth is, you know, to be a perfect parent, you would need to engage in a process of complete self-sacrifice, and that's unrealistic. But the point is, if you can be a good enough parent, then the child will grow up believing that they're good enough. And they won't necessarily be a very powerful sovereign, but they will have sufficient sovereignty in them to live a life that's okay. Let's put it that way. But I think now we're in a position where most children don't really get that. And it's not the parents' fault necessarily. Parents who are doing two jobs, trying to make ends meet, stretched to the limit, etc., etc. We all know that cultural change is happening around us, and it's not a positive cultural change. Children just don't get the reinforcement they need that teaches them they are good enough. But what they actually get instead is, I'm not good enough. In some way, I'm deficient. I need to either try harder or be strong. And those are two awful and powerful messages that, if implanted in a child, can do immense harm. Because if you think about, I'm not good enough, it means nothing I do will ever be good enough, and therefore I must try harder to be better. And there's the beginning of an endless cycle of self-reproach and striving for impossible achievement. I tell the story in the book of a woman on a workshop that I attended some years back. And it's something I've heard a few times. You know, it's classic. So she said, every time I went home, she lived in a particularly aspirant culture, Singaporean Chinese, which is all about achievement. Every time I went home with a test paper and I got 98%, my father never once said, well done, congratulations, that's great. But all he ever said was, if you had tried harder, you could have got 100%. And by doing that, he instilled in her a belief that she was just not good enough, that she had to try hard. And what goes along with that is another belief, that you have to be strong, that you have to struggle. Because actually, if you're constantly trying to do better, that is a struggle, because you're trying to do better than you actually can do. So the three things, I'm not good enough, try hard, be strong, they manifest as, life is a struggle, I can't do it, I'm not good enough, I will never be good enough, no matter how hard I try, I will never be good enough. And ultimately, I suppose, for those who give up in the face of it, I might as well not bother. And then there's a collapse of sovereignty in the sense of, you know, this is just pointless. Why should I try? I'm never going to be good enough. As opposed to, do you know what? I may have really messed that up, but actually that's okay, because next time I know I can do it properly, I can do it better, and that's fine. And I'm not bothered about the fact that I messed it up. In fact, as a king, how nice it would be to say, do you know what? I really don't like the way things are looking around here, but that doesn't bother me because I know I have the power and confidence and will to change it into what I do want to have happen around here. It's complete self-confidence and self-assurance and a sense of being in control of what happens, as opposed to a sense of, oh, I got 98% and I'm not good enough. You know? And the interesting thing about that was that she then said, in fact, the facilitator asked that woman who'd been subject to her father's tyranny, let's call it that, well, what would you think would have satisfied him? And she thought for a moment. She said, I think if I'd been an astronaut, he'd have been satisfied. And the tragedy is he wouldn't, because if she had come home and said, Dad, I've been accepted on the International Space Station, he would have said something like, well, if you tried harder, you could have been on the mission to Mars or something. You know, it's like there's nothing that's ever good enough in that. It's a kind of powerful way of destroying somebody's sovereignty.
Yeah.
So the beliefs are around those things, Piers. I'm not good enough. I can't do it. Life is a struggle. I can only achieve by really exerting myself. Try hard. I must try hard. I've got to be strong. Those are the beliefs that underpin the wounded sovereign. And, you know, actually, I've seen quite a few people whose lives superficially look quite successful. They've achieved a lot and they've kind of emerged in a good place. And then when you really start diving down with them into their lives, what you discover is that almost every achievement has been the outcome of something I could describe as chaos or struggle or something very challenging. And they don't even recognize that. Mm-hmm. Because they're blind to the fact that this success did not flow to them easily. That in some sense, they were still following this childhood programming of try hard, be strong, got to do better. Your best isn't good enough. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I really can relate to that, of the I'm not good enough. I went to a workshop about 5 or 6 years ago, and the facilitator said, who here in the room has the belief I'm not good enough? Everyone in the room put their hand up. And I realized that's been, you know, it's about 3 or 4 years ago that I started to take that away from my life, as in remove it. And I realized I used to do things and I would fail, and now I'm not good enough, and I'd give up. I'd do something else, and I'd spiral round. I'd never get anywhere because I was just going around in circles. And as I started to work on that, it was like, okay, yeah, I have that belief, and I kept going, and therefore I broke out of that cycle. And it makes me reflect, listening to Robert Moore talk on the longer lecture series about the king. He says that any king in history, you know, or not any, but a lot of kings, so Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, he says a lot of these people who are embodying king energy, people didn't like them.
That's very true.
And I think if you feel you're not good enough, you go, oh my God, I have to hide away. So it's almost like those beliefs stop us being in the king. So, wow, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Bang on. Good point. The one thing a king has to be able to do is take the knocks, because they will come. They absolutely will come. Same for a queen, and it's not a male thing. Anybody who stands up above the crowd and dares to be different, and I'm here talking in a positive way, in a benevolent, good way, will get knocked by people who feel less than, or people who have some kind of repressed sense of grandiosity and inflation, and how dare he stand up there if I'm not being seen? If, you know, there's a kind of, I suppose, jealousy, envy at work, actually. Envy would be a better word. But yeah, it's the one thing a leader who steps up has to be aware of. They'll get the knocks, they'll come. And of course, part of kingship is having that Teflon suit, that imaginary Teflon suit where these things just wash off, you know, and then that can be seen as arrogance. So there's a lot of self-reliance required to be a good king, to be a great queen. Self-reliance, self-confidence, self-assurance. And that's not a sense of self-righteousness, by the way. That's just a confidence and a wisdom based on the fact that generally decisions are good, things go well. Mm-hmm. So you have a bed of experience, a bedrock of experience that informs your own sense of your kingship and queenship. And it does make me think, incidentally, in passing, that if you're a good king or a good queen, you can't do it on your own. You need the company of fellow sovereigns who can support you in that. You absolutely need the company of fellow sovereigns from outside your world who can meet with you and say, yeah, I hear you. That wasn't fair. That wasn't right. You are okay. You're doing the right thing. Or who can say, by the way, I think you've gone off track there. How about this as an approach? Why don't you try doing it differently? In other words, mentoring, peer mentoring amongst kings is essential, and queens is essential.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I see that that's something you mentioned that at the beginning, the importance of having that support from other kings and queens. And I see that that's one of the things these last couple of years has separated us, that we are more isolated. We're online rather than meeting face to face. I went to an I group, one of the MKP groups, a month or so ago. There was only 5 of us there. First time we'd met since lockdown, so for 2 years. It was just lovely. It felt like 5 kings sat together, going, oh, it's good to see you guys.
It's beautiful, isn't it? And I completely agree. There's nothing like being in the same room where you can smell and taste and feel the energy of somebody. Although Zoom has been a good substitute, it's not a complete substitute. You need to be with people, and sit with them in the silence and see what arises and feel into them. All those beautiful qualities of bonding and companionship and relationship that actually we're programmed to need.
Yeah. Thank you, Rod. So, I mean, before we began, so the next question really is, what would you say is the key emotion of the king, the sovereign, and why is this emotion so important for a
Great. Well, thanks for checking in with that, because it is an important question. I'm glad you mentioned it. You know, when we in MKP speak of the sovereign, we always speak of joy. And I think for perhaps people who don't understand what this is about, this is hard to grasp. But how can you be joyous all the time? But I don't see it quite like that. I think what it really is, Piers, is a state of contentment that can arise into joy and happiness. And one of the things that I use to measure this is a question about happiness, because that is something people can relate to. So if you imagine a happiness scale from 0 to 10, where 5 is neither happy nor unhappy, and 0 is, let's say, suicidally depressed, and 10 is the most joyous state you could imagine. A very interesting question I find to ask people is, on that scale of 0 to 10, what's your happiness level? And if somebody says something like, well, it's generally 6, but sometimes it reaches 8, or it's generally around 6, 7, 8, I think that's a person probably living in a state of joy. May not be ecstatic kind of outbursts of joy, but it's contentment and happiness, that there's a sense inside them that everything's okay. They're not depressed. They're not in fear. They're happy. They're content. And I think that's how I see the construct of joy. And of course, it can be those moments of sheer abundant joy where everything just bursts into sweet. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. We had one before we started.
We did.
I did nowhere.
La 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 la.
Exactly. And it just produced hysterics in both of us. It's like joy of just meeting and sharing that moment.
I was trying not to burst into laughter in the first 10 minutes, actually.
Were you? Yeah, absolutely great. I didn't realize you did it. You hit it very well. Yes. So yes, joy, but let's call it things like happiness, softness, compassion, fun, laughter. a sense of well-being, really. Yeah. Now, there's something interesting about that. And for me, it's again related to that energy flow from the inner child to the sovereign. What I've observed is you can't really embody a constant state of happiness or joy in that sense unless you have grieved the majority of your losses. And I base that comment on whatever it is, 20 years working with men and women in groups, where happiness seems to follow a lot of grieving. Now, I'm not quite sure why grief, the presence of grief in the system should block the access to joy. But I suspect it's got something to do with the fact that when you shut down your grief, which is what most people seem to do in this society, you also shut down the joy. Yeah. Interestingly enough, you don't shut down your fear or anger, strangely enough. But anyway, I mean, without going into the specifics of this strange relationship between joy and grief, what I've definitely seen is the more people cry, the happier they become. And you might say, well, that's obvious. But actually, when you think about it, it's not, because many of the losses that we've experienced, we're not even in touch with. What about the loss of a good parent? I don't mean the death of a good parent. I mean, what about the loss of not having good parenting as a child? What about the loss of all the opportunities and rewards of, yeah, I love you, darling. You're a beautiful girl. I mean, I don't know about you, but my parents did not say they loved me once in my entire life. When you think about the magnitude of that loss, and that's kind of an intangible loss. It's something that most people those kind of losses are losses most people don't even know they've experienced. I mean, if somebody dies, you know about it. But the loss of what you should have had, wow, now that's much more subtle. But when you dive into your grief, I've seen people, including myself, begin to grieve what they should have had but didn't, as well as grieving what they know they lost. And they'll say things like, I can't grieve, it's too painful. Just can't do it, it's too painful. But the mistake there is that what's painful is the holding of the grief. Once the expression of the grief starts, the pain diminishes. And people will say things like, it's an ocean, I'll never grieve enough. But the fact is, after many, many episodes of grieving, suddenly they find their heads are out of the water and they can breathe again. And that's the moment at which joy becomes more accessible, more a constant state of being. So maybe that's the simple relationship between the two, is this, that when you're holding, consciously or unconsciously, a lot of grief, you just can't access your joy. And when you release the space by shedding the tears, then joy becomes much more accessible. And I mean, I've seen that so many times over the decades I've been doing this work.
Yeah, I've said before in the podcast that, yeah, it was me. I was very depressed and suicidal. And once I started to grieve, it was a long process. Yeah. I feel it was a bit like this, my heart. Once I started to grieve, the tears came out, but then it was like the flower was there.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, oh, actually, my heart can feel now. And
absolutely. Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So we've kind of answered question 7 already. So I think for me, the next question really is about how we cultivate the king. What are the steps we can take to embody the king more fully in our lives? And maybe the second aspect of that is then how do we bring it into society, which comes back to that.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I'm just kind of looking at a few notes that I made before we started. It's a challenge, that's for sure, because so much of this, as I already said, and we talked about this earlier, was that infusion of king energy or queen energy into you as a child, just by being around people who model that. And although that is the foundation of kingship, I think it can be learnt in adulthood. But I think what it requires is a very conscious intention say always, what is the king's intention? This is the word more than any other, I think, that things the king does need to be have a clear intention behind them. In other words, if you want to put that more simply, it's a decision to do something or to be a certain way or to make a difference in some way to the way you're living your life. But it's got to be a decision that's backed up by some kind of inner energy of desire. So as far as making up for what you didn't have in childhood is concerned, this would be like, I want to be around people who have more of this sovereign quality. So how am I going to do that? Okay, I'm going to find a group of people that I respect who I see as having sovereign quality, and I'm going to form a group, and we're going to meet every 2 weeks just to sit together and talk about whatever arises. Or I need a mentor. I need a specific one-to-one mentoring relationship, and I'm going to set out to find that person who can help me step into my sovereignty, and I'm not going to stop until I've found it. And if I'm disappointed the first 5 times, I will carry on until I find one, the 6th attempt or whatever. And there's, you see in that, by the way, there's a kind of beautiful combination of king energy and warrior energy. Like the king wants something. I want a mentor. I want to find it. The warrior is charged with the task of going out there and getting it, and he won't give up until he's found the right mentor that the king says, now this is the man or woman that I need to be with, who can help me step more fully into my power. So the other thing you can do is fake it till you make it. I know that's a cliche in the world of self-development, but there's huge truth in it, because actually what faking it till you make it means is that you step up, you do those things you're frightened of. So if you're frightened of public speaking, you go to Toastmasters, which is not just about learning how to give a toast, it's about learning how to speak in public. If you're frightened of acting, you join an amateur dramatics class, and so on and so forth. That you actually make the decision, despite your fear and doubt, to do the thing in a small way that will allow you to experience and grow the skill of being able to do it in a bigger way. So that isn't exactly faking it till you make it, but you might have to fake the confidence and self-assurance and certainty that comes with it, until actually one day you wake up and you find, actually, you know what? I am a pretty good actor. You know what? I could actually make a speech at Fred's wedding in December without shaking at the knees and dropping my pages on the floor. And in fact, you know what? I might even enjoy it. And so on and so forth. And that first step, fake it till you make it. Just go out there and look like you're confident. Find a way and do it, even if it's on a small scale. Because it's by the experience of success. Remember that cliche of the world of self-development. Nothing succeeds like success. But how true? Because that gives you the reinforcement and feedback that actually, do you know what? I can do this. I can make a speech. I can go on stage. I can lead men on an adventure weekend or whatever it is. You know, and I think, as I say that, I think of boys who go into the Scouts, for example. Boys who go into rugby and get coached through different stages of development, become leaders and captains. They've had that gradation of experience, that gradually increasing experience that allows them to learn these things are possible for me. I can do them. And there's a very clear choice in all of this. Some people will go, you know what, I just can't be asked. I'm not going to do that. And some people will go, actually, I can do that. And I will do it. And in fact, I'll start as soon as I can, you know, as soon as I can find the right people in the right place, I'm off and running, as opposed to put it off till tomorrow. You know, there's a difference in the king's intention, quality of that energy. So I say, what this means for me is that becoming a king, cultivating king energy, cultivating queen energy, is underpinned by a very clear desire and choice. To want to do it, to want to be a leader, not a follower, to want to be up there at the front, being seen and heard. And for some people, I can understand that is a very frightening prospect. Very frightening.
Yeah, me, I mean, I've kind of was always follower, you know, school my way was just not to speak. So to actually speak, it's like, so yeah, it was terrifying. Still is.
So what
bit.
happened? I was going to say, what happened between then and now? You're leading a podcast. This is episode 37, 38.
I think partly it's because I think I heard Robert Moore say this, or maybe it was you in your book, saying that if you see a need, there is a need, or people are struggling and no one else is doing it, the king goes, right, I have to do it. No, I'm waiting for other people to do this stuff. And I think that was it. It was probably 2 years ago. Yeah, around lockdown. I was obviously doing my work in the background, but then it was that point that, well, men are really struggling here.
Yeah.
They need help. So that's when I started my men's circle and did the podcast. It's like, well, who else is? So it's like, okay, there you go. And
Exactly.
I'm not a very confident public speaker. So it's like, okay, go on then, I'll do it.
Well, I think it's fabulous. And it's just absolutely what I'm talking about. Yeah. That somehow you find the resources and you do it. And that's the basis of kingship. That's the basis of queenship. There's a need. Something needs to happen here. Something has to change here. I am not happy with the way things are. I'm going to do something about it. And in that moment of the decision is the potential for everything that follows.
And just before I finish there, that point you finished that point is it's people like yourself as well, having your support, because doing the podcast, I had lots of people say, I'm not interested or not get back to me. I've had probably hundreds over the time, but people like yourself going, yeah, I'm here to support you. I'm busy. I don't have the time, but I'm going to speak to peers. So I think having benevolent elders like yourself supporting me, that's been huge. And my wife as well. Amazing.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I spoke to the Telegraph last week. I had this on my last podcast, and I had my brain just went into meltdown. I just was frozen because I was speaking up about my boarding school.
Oh, I see. Of course. Yeah.
And, but my wife was like, no, keep going, please. I'm like, oh, okay, go on.
Brilliant.
So, yeah.
And on the subject of elders, there's the other key, isn't it? I've talked about mentors and surrounding yourself with fellow sovereigns. But actually, what about the question of elders? Here's a fascinating thing. I don't know why I'd forgotten to mention this, but thank you for bringing it up. Who have we got in our society who could really pass as a wise elder? I mean, you count, well, it's a metaphor, isn't it? You could count them on the fingers of one hand. I can't think of any actually right now, although I know there must be wise elders in my orbit somewhere. But they're not, it's not like we respect elders. It's not like we have a cultural thing about, elders are the most valuable resource we've got because they carry wisdom and knowledge that we all need. Actually, it reminds me, as I say that, Piers, of when I used to work a long time ago in a different life for a large chemical company called ICI. They decided they were not doing very well, mostly because their leadership was rubbish, actually, complacent, self-serving. Those would be two words that would certainly be true, I think. So they decided they had to do something to ensure the company's future. And guess what they did? They made every person in the company over 50 years of age redundant, thereby to stroke getting rid of all that accumulated knowledge and wisdom that nobody would ever know about or had written down in a textbook. It was born of years, decades of experience. That didn't help solve the problem. But I thought at the time it was one of the most extraordinary corporate decisions I'd ever seen. And I know other companies have done it since, because of course people over 50 are the most expensive. And you save the greatest amount of money by making them redundant. But actually what you then lose is the structure, the backbone that holds the company together. And of course, the rest was history. Despite that, ICI went out of business and was sold to a Dutch company. What was left of it was sold to a Dutch company. And if you wanted a real life practical example of corporate failure of kingship, that's the one.
Mm.
And it would be fair to say I ended up working before I decided I'd had enough of it and made the decision to leave. I ended up working for part of the company where the management was, in my judgment, definitely self-serving. Didn't care at all about people they were nominally leading. They were concerned about their own financial survival, pension benefits, and so on. It was actually quite a sickening display of self-interest. And people would say, well, of course people would be like that, wouldn't they? That's how people are. Well, actually, that's how some people are, but it's not how true kings and true leaders are. True leaders and kings look out for the benefit of the whole kingdom. So anyway, it's just come back to me after many years. That's never struck me before.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So so we've got probably about 5 minutes left. We've spoken a little bit about mission and purpose. I mean, is there anything else you want to add in about cultivating king energy? And maybe it's how we bring that energy into society now.
Yeah. I think one of the things is there's a spiritual side to it, that spending time in nature, whether it's on something like a vision quest or it's just simply going out and sitting in nature for a day or taking a walk in the hills, probably on your own, is a very powerful way of reconnecting with something bigger than yourself. So the way I see kings and queens is that actually, in some spiritual sense, they're connected to something higher than themselves, something lower than themselves. The earth below them, the heavens above. You know, I mean, people may or may not choose to believe such things. That doesn't matter to me. My belief system is kings and queens stand between heaven and earth, for want of a better expression, and that in that standing between heaven and earth, they are supported. But to maintain that sense of being supported in that way, there needs to be a spiritual life to kingship and leadership, even if the spiritual life is, as I suggested a moment ago, just simply being in nature. And it can be something much more complicated than that. It can be a spiritual practice, a vision quest, etc. So that's definitely an aspect of developing strong kingship or queenship, that you have a vision that's bigger than yourself. I mean, vision that of the world and the structure of the world and your place in it. Anything else? Surrounding yourself with the right people, we've already covered that. That's definitely important. And doing personal work, continuing to do personal work in the appropriate place, you know, where you can actually still address those emotional wounds and those remnants of I'm not good enough, or I need to try hard, or life is a struggle, or whatever it is. And I think also there are workshops, there are people out there who are running workshops devoted to developing the qualities of kingship. In fact, although I'm not there at the moment, I'm not going to be involved in it at the moment because I've had some other issues to deal with. My facilitation colleague, Ed Rook, is currently I think he's probably already planned it, because we've run 3 of them before together, Finding the King Within. So a weekend retreat at the Earth Spirit Centre in Glastonbury. I think there's still some places left, and the details of that are on my website, which I think you have on the list of resources.
Yes.
Strong Free Men. And that represents a safe container where people can, it is a male retreat workshop actually, so men can go and explore aspects of kingship, do work about developing kingship, finding out what stops them from stepping into kingship, what's the fear that's holding you back from your own power, that kind of thing. Great little workshop. I highly recommend it, and there will be another later in the year. So even if you don't get there fast enough to sign up for this one, anybody who's watching this podcast could send an email to me or to Ed, just asking to reserve a place on the next one and be notified as soon as that's scheduled. And a quick search around the net will find you other people who are doing this work. So that's always useful. Plenty of resources out there. And for women, I'd invite them to look at Celebration of Being, which is a UK organisation has various workshops. I think you might have been on the Nobleman workshop. Is that right, Piers?
Oh, not yet, no.
Okay. Well, that's for men, and there are workshops for women, which are about stepping into power. And Women in Power too, which is always signed up the minute registration opens. That's about women exploring their power and stepping out of, as I understand it, I obviously haven't been on one of the workshops, but as I understand it, it's about embodying the full nature of female power, rather than the kind of suppression that society might introduce into a woman's life.
Is that the sister organisation to the Mankind Project?
It's not a sister organisation, although I think it may have been started by the wife of one of the founders of MKP. Okay. I'm not absolutely sure. There's another organisation called Woman Within, which was started by Rich Tosey's wife, I believe. And I'm not sure whether Women in Power grew out of that or was a later development. Okay. But whatever, it's an organisation that can certainly encourage women to step into their power. Celebration of Being, and finding the king within, all the resources that are available right now. And, of course, dare I say it, people could get this and read the chapter on kingship, see if it resonates. Oh, great. That's double the excitement.
Oh, well, this one, I said this earlier, I managed to get a hold of a signed copy by Rod Boothroyd. So, well, thank you, Rod. Any last words you'd like to share? So obviously I'll put all the links in the description for Rod's work and the books he's kind of his books, other things, links to Women Within, etc. Celebration of Being. Anything else you'd like to share?
Well, I'm remembering in this moment, Piers, Joanna Macy, I think it was, who said, may have got that wrong, but the saying was, be the change. Perhaps it was somebody earlier than Joanna, perhaps it was Gandhi, I'm not sure. But be the change. If you don't, who will be? And I suppose what arises as I say that in my mind is, do you want your children to grow up in the same kind of world that we are now living in? And if you don't, are you going to step up into your own kingship and do something about it?
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. Oh,
always a pleasure, Piers.
It's been a real honor, Rod. And thank you so much for your wisdom, your love, and your modeling of King energy.
Well, thank you for acknowledging that. I was quite taken aback, Piers, in saying, actually, one can have an influence without even knowing it.
Thank you, brother. Okay.
Thank you. I'll see you next time.
See you next time.